All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get right into part three. Thanks for sticking with us. We're going to talk some technology change. And first, we'll start with the 1910 automobile cars. Everything's going to change. Of course, the first car is going to come out in the 1910s, right? But they were kind of for the wealthiest of the wealthy. What's really going to change is when we reach the 1920s and the Model T Ford, also known as the Flivver. These things were cheap, they were affordable, you could buy them in installment, and so more and more people are going to get these things. You can get them in different colors. It's this explosion of this new car economy, right? Because in 1910, there's 180,000 cars. People made fun of them. They would yell things, get a horse, buddy. By 1914, there's 500,000 cars. We just went from 200,000 in 4 years to 500,000, and then we're going to see by the 1930s, by the end of the decade, 20 million cars. Just this explosion in cars. We're also going to see pretty early on some competition against Ford, which you don't hear about as much, but Chevy, the Plymouth, Pontiac, dozens more are going to come out. But by the end of the 20s, 1 in 5 people will have cars. The biggest percentage in the world at the time, probably still the highest percentage in the world as far as I know. Fordissimus is on the screen there. This even became a part of the vocabulary, right? That meant it's something that was efficient and cheap and mass-produced. Fordissimus. The downside of all these cars, of course, was the rise in car accidents and car fatalities. In 1924 alone, 11,500 car fatalities. People were dying left and right. This was just a horrific and frightening time to be on the roads, really. By 1951, 1 million Americans dead in automobile accidents, more than all of our wars, really just 30 years into the car industry, and it's killed more people than all of the wars combined, right? And the thing about cars, of course, is that it means a car economy, because what is all related to the car? Right? And here's the 1930s automobile, by the way. They're starting to get a little bit fancier and nicer. No, I don't want the radio yet. The car economy means people need gasoline. You need rubber for your tires. You need leather for the chairs. You need glass for the windows. And you need roads. So there's a boom in road building. Billions of dollars spent in the 1920s on road building, all still local at the time, states and cities and municipalities. And then hotels along the roads and restaurants along the roads, and people can move more easily. So there's a housing boom. So there's this economic explosion related to it. And there's a culture that comes out of the car, right? The car culture. And some people hated this thing. They called it the demon machine. One of its nicknames was the house of prostitution on wheels. People thought, oh my God, cars. People are going to get in cars, boys and girls together, and they're going to drive, and they're going to go places, and they're going to park. That's what they called it back then. Anyways, the expression is if the car got people out of the house, something that was invented in the 20s brought them back into the house, and it was in fact the radio, the old radios. These things were huge. They're like the size of old television sets, right? It would fill up your living room. I don't know if this will work, but the first commercial I'm not even going to try it, actually. First commercial radio broadcast came in November of 1920. The few people who owned a radio were listening. They were appealed to their radios. And the first commercial broadcast was a political announcement. And you can still get this on KDKA Radio, kdkaradio.com. And it's an announcement of who won the presidential election. 6 p.m. that night, they announced that it was Warren G. Harding, the new president of the United States. And, of course, everything goes from there, right? This radio becomes huge. Here's a great picture in 22 of the family gathered around this massive radio, and they're listening. And the first popular show on the radio was called Amos and Andy. And it was two white guys pretending to be African American doing sort of a minstrel show on the radio. And so we're going to see impact of our racial relations in America on our popular culture. Another important cultural transition, or technological one, I should say, of the 20s was the airplane. And here's one of the great heroes of the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh. If we can do a quick historical review of the airplane, 1903 was what we call the invention at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers. By World War I, they were being used, of course, the Red Baron we talked about. By 1920, airmail was a pretty regular thing. But what happens in 1927, this guy known as the Flying Fool, Charles Lindbergh, becomes the first person to cross the Atlantic Ocean in an airplane by himself. Pretty exciting stuff. He becomes popular, not popular, but famous in the news again in the 1930s when his son was kidnapped and sadly killed, which led to the passing of a law that gave the death penalty for interstate abductions, which is still on the books today. Entertainment. We go right from the airplane to entertainment. Film, the movie industry dramatically transforming in this time period, right? Let's go back to the origins of film. The first moving pictures that we know of were actually penny peep shows. And then it goes from there to what we call the first motion picture. This thing was like, I don't know, it's 14 minutes long, and it was called The Great Train Robbery, 1903, and it was a holdup of this train by these famous Western outlaws. Pretty exciting stuff. And then that brings us to the first feature film, which I don't remember if we mentioned it or not. You probably heard of it. It's the Birth of a Nation, 1915. It's this movie that is all about the great, wonderful KKK. That's sarcasm in case you didn't notice. But it portrays Reconstruction as this catastrophe. It's this really, really nasty film where this African-American character just dares to even touch a white woman, and the KKK comes in and kills him and does all kinds of terrible things to save the day. Glory, glory, right? It's just awful in some ways, but it's considered one of the most important films in American history, Birth of a Nation. Adapted from a book called The Klansman, so you get an idea from there, right? What happens in the 20s, the important movie, 1927, it's the first talkie. It's the first talking movie. It's the first of a series, and it's called The Jazz Singer, starring Al Jolson. And you can see a picture of him up there in the corner, and of course he is a Jewish New Yorker who is in blackface, and so we're still in that racial theme. It's him pretending to be a goofy African American. It's a minstrel show. It's the same thing that we've been doing since the time of slavery, just with new technology. And that's the first of those. We also mentioned and played a little bit of the Louis Armstrong for you earlier, the jazz, not the birth of jazz, but the explosion of jazz. Here's Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. Awesome stuff. Here he is with his famous trumpet. It's music that came up from New Orleans, of course, during the Great Migration and spread to St. Louis, Kansas City, and up through Chicago. The Harlem Renaissance was another important dynamic of the 1920s. Harlem, New York, becomes the largest black community in the world, and it's an exciting time. Music and authors and poets and theater and the street scene and all kinds of exciting things. Names you should recognize up here on the screen: Louis and Duke and Billie Holiday, and the writers like Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes. The Cotton Club was kind of the hot place to be, right? All kinds of exciting things were going on in this community. Painters and artists and dances, and here's a map that just sort of shows you can go to Harlem and visit all these incredible sites and important figures of the 1920s, this exciting developing culture. Lots of important names and things. This is far more detail than we're going to get into, but just to realize one of my favorites, the poet Langston Hughes. He will begin in the 20s and he'll be writing through the 30s, so we'll talk more about him later. Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly. Langston has some fantastic stuff, and like I said, we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the civil rights movement, but really kind of planting the seeds for this civil rights movement. They're not talking about equality or change yet, not so much, but they are a really important part of this pride and sense of self developing in the African-American community. One of Langston's best poems, of course, A Dream Deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load. Or does it explode? Think about that one as we move into the civil rights movement. I'm going to skip that one for now because we're going to be too long. Zora Neale Hurston and her famous books, Their Eyes Were Watching God and Color Struck. Marcus Garvey, a philosopher of the time period with his Back to Africa movement. He was a Jamaican-born, and he talked about working to protect the constitutional rights of black Americans and talked about moving back to Africa. He will later be discredited for having embezzled some funds and finds himself into all kinds of trouble. And then another great civil rights founder of the civil rights movement, A. Philip Randolph. People all know Martin Luther King Jr., but often they don't know this fellow, A. Philip Randolph, and he will become one of the central figures, really, of the civil rights movement. But he starts his work in the 1920s during this Harlem Renaissance. Couple of other cultural changes: architecture, an explosion in new forms of architecture. It's the era of Frank Lloyd Wright. It's the era of this fellow, Joseph Stella. He has this great quote, "I have seen the future and it is good. We will wipe away the religions of old and start anew." And so what do you see in this painting? Right? Some people look at it and they think it's kind of like the stained glass windows of a church, but it's the Brooklyn Bridge, right? And it's meant to be like this church or shrine praise of technology and change and moving towards the future. So here we see that embracing of change. When we looked back in the 1840s, you could either embrace change and push forward, or you could become conservative and hold back and fear change. And those are the two common responses, or the mixture of the two, right? Here's Frank Lloyd Wright with his famous materialism meets functionalism. So it's this beautiful, gorgeous falling waters, but it's also a house. Somebody lives there, right? Actually, I think it's a museum now. I'm not sure. Develops the Guggenheim Museum. It's the birth of the Empire State Building. 1931 is when it's completed, but it's built during the 20s, 102 stories high, the largest skyscraper in the world at the time. Of course, it's dwarfed now by other buildings. Literature. Let's talk about this explosion of new literature of the 1920s. H.L. Mencken. He was something of a comedian. He talked about and made fun of the middle class of Americans. We also have F. Scott Fitzgerald with The Great Gatsby, and he also wrote This Side of Paradise, which was known as the Flapper Bible. That's a good one to make sure you're aware of. Everybody, I think, knows The Great Gatsby with its glamour and its kind of excesses of the 1920s. But This Side of Paradise with its dancing and its car driving and drinking and smoking and the new woman and the short hair and the skirts and the flapper girl and all that, right? Here's Fitzgerald and his wife. Sinclair Lewis is our other important author. He wrote Main Street, which was a book that talks about an imaginary place called Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, where he sort of makes fun of the narrowness and the provincialism of middle-class America. And then this Babbitt, right? Babbitt, a satire of American culture and society and behavior, and it focuses on the importance of conformity and being just like everybody else and keeping up with the neighbors and joining all these clubs and being successful. He calls it the vacuity of middle-class American life. So there's a sense of real resentment and frustration with what's happening to America, and that's what authors were writing about. Here's my all-time favorite image of Ernest Hemingway, and this is when he writes The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, a whole era, a generation of authors disillusioned with war, disillusioned with politics, a lot of them known as moving to Europe, the Lost Generation, living in Paris. Was kind of the place to be for the authors of the time. Ernest Hemingway, I mentioned. William Faulkner, writing in the South, The Sound and the Fury. We talked about Zora Neale Hurston. We didn't talk about some poets, T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, and E.E. Cummings. And I would mention that the most popular song in the early 1920s was called Ain't We Got Fun by Whiting and Kahn. And kind of a funny line in that song, an ironic line, was the rich get rich and the poor get children. Let's move on before we finish part 3 to Prohibition. The 18th Amendment is passed in 1919, and all of a sudden alcohol becomes illegal. Now, a lot of times people think of this as a restriction of people's rights. They don't see it the way it was seen back then, which was a part of the progressive movement. It was actually seen as something that was being done to help people, to make people's lives better, to improve people's lives. But the end result was exactly where you began from, which was it took away people's rights and people's freedom and ability to make their own choices. And also imagine the soldiers returning from World War I really feeling like some fast one had been pulled over on them because suddenly they couldn't get a drink when they came home. Now, it's important to note that before Prohibition kicks in, it was spreading across America. More than half the counties in the country were already dry when this 18th Amendment passes in 1919. The biggest holdouts were the cities, and that's where you had the most immigrants, and this was insane to those immigrant communities where beer and wine was a part of their community and their culture and their lives, right? Important to know also the Volstead Act. That's the law passed by Congress to enforce the amendment, to make, as one author said, the world's safe for hypocrisy, because what happens is the wealthy can pay bribes and can pay money and can get drinks in their speakeasies. They can get the alcohol, and for the poor it becomes much more difficult. There's massive resistance, especially in the cities. The law is completely flaunted. It creates also a whole rise in gangsterism and organized crime. It's the birth of organized crime. Excuse this somewhat graphic image. This is the famous Valentine's Day Massacre, the Al Capone's gang against another gang. This was Chicago. These guys made a whole unbelievable amount of wealth by providing alcohol. This guy was so popular, he lived in the Central Hotel downtown, and you couldn't touch the guy. Ironically, the famous group Eliot Ness and his Untouchables, this is the Kevin Costner movie version of the story, but that's based on a real character and a real story. They actually brought him down by busting him on income tax fraud. He was not paying his income tax, and that's what eventually sent him to Alcatraz, where he later died of syphilis. It's generally seen as a total catastrophe, teaching people to not believe in the law, to break the law. The underworld economy grows to $18 billion a year. Huge, right? And then when you make liquor legal again, because they repealed this amendment at the end of the decade, the underworld economy still stays there, and it moves into other drugs and into prostitution and into other kinds of violent crime. So total disaster, although one positive that comes out of this period of Prohibition was a major decrease in the consumption of alcohol. We still, of course, have alcoholism and those kinds of problems in America, but the kind of drinking that went on before the 20s and during the early 20s was really just unbelievable, the quantities that were being consumed and the way it was destroying communities. We will stop there and get ourselves ready for the final part.